91%. That is how many men of Japan's carrier fleet never returned. 91 of every 100 sailors and aviators vanished into fire, smoke, or the dark waters of the Pacific. The Empire built the most elite naval air arm the world had ever seen. Yet by the final summer of war, almost every man was gone, every ship sunk, every dream consumed. What turned the strongest fleet in the Pacific into a graveyard within only 3 years? The answer is darker than spirit, more unforgiving than courage. It lies in choices, in doctrine, in faith, placed where numbers could not be denied. Stay with us, because this is not only a story about ships and planes. It is a story about men, about illusions, and about a nation that gambled its soul on war. In the years before the Pacific erupted, the sea was already changing. Battleships, once crowned as the giants of ocean power, were being eclipsed by a new weapon: the aircraft carrier. Japan, bound by the Washington and London treaties, could not match America ship for ship, but carriers slipped through the cracks. To Japanese admirals, these floating airfields became the sword of destiny. They poured their brightest minds and boldest resources into Akagi, into Kaga, into Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These were not only machines of steel but symbols of a rising empire, determined to prove itself upon the world stage. And yet, within that creation, seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The story begins not in fire but in silence, in treaty halls where ink reshaped the balance of seas. After the First World War, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and later the London Treaty of 1930 forced limits upon the great naval powers. Battleships, once the measure of pride, were capped, their numbers bound by paper. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this seemed like humiliation. Yet in the narrow lines of legal language, a loophole opened. Aircraft carriers were restricted, but far less tightly. Where battleships were chained, carriers could grow. In Tokyo's war colleges, the admirals studied this loophole with an obsessive gaze. To them, the path of destiny lay not in gunnery duels across the horizon but in air power. They dreamed of a decisive battle. Kantai Kessen, one strike so devastating it would cripple the American fleet before its guns could fire. Carriers, not battleships, would deliver that blow. Thus, the steel of old hulls was reborn. Akagi rose from the unfinished frame of a battlecruiser. Kaga was reshaped from a scrapped battleship plan. Their decks stretched across the sea, vast runways above the waves. In time, new giants followed. Shokaku and Zuikaku, sleek and modern, their bows slicing water like blades. The Crane Sisters, as sailors called them, could carry more than 80 aircraft each. They were pride, they were power, they were promise. Yet machines alone did not forge the fleet's might. It was the men who trained upon them, the aviators shaped in the crucible of unforgiving instruction. Japanese naval pilots were not born, they were tempered. To wear the wings of the Imperial Navy demanded more than skill, it demanded sacrifice. Candidates flew more than 800 hours before combat readiness. They practiced landings until muscle remembered what fear tried to erase. Half who began the training never reached the cockpit of a Zero fighter. The survivors were legends before their first battle, their names printed in newspapers, their faces praised as samurai of the skies. The carriers themselves became floating cities of discipline. Below decks, sailors drilled ceaselessly, polishing brass, scrubbing steel, fueling planes with ritual precision. Above, the Zero fighters gleamed beneath the sun, wings folded tight, engines ready to roar. Life was routine, yet charged with anticipation. Each man knew that when orders came, their steel cities would unleash storms across the Pacific. The storm came on the morning of Pleng, December 7, 1941. At dawn, 6 carriers of the 1st Air Fleet, Kido Butai, rose from the quiet waters north of Hawaii. They launched more than 350 aircraft into the pale light. Engines screamed as the swarm crossed the ocean sky, and in minutes the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor lay burning. Battleships erupted, airfields shattered, smoke climbed above the palm trees. For Japan, it was proof that destiny had been chosen well. The doctrine seemed flawless, Carriers had struck from afar, delivered devastation, and vanished before the enemy could strike back. In mess halls aboard Akagi and Kaga, sailors toasted with tea, voices swelling with triumph. They believed the war was already won, that Bushido spirit and decisive battle had proven themselves beyond doubt. But beneath that triumph lay assumptions as fragile as the steel that carried them. Their ships had been built to strike, not to endure. Their crews had been taught to kill, not to survive. They believed sacrifice itself could shield them where armor could not. Spirit was made the substitute for numbers, for logistics, for endurance. In that first winter of war, no one aboard Kido Butai could see the abyss ahead. To them, the empire had risen on wings of fire, and the Pacific lay open. But history would reveal that in those same carriers, in that same doctrine, the seeds of their destruction were already waiting. Victory can be the cruelest teacher. For Japan, the brilliance of Pearl Harbor concealed cracks that would soon widen into catastrophe. The first flaw lay in how Japan valued its aces. In the United States, veteran pilots were rotated home after combat tours. They trained the next generation, passing on skill, ensuring that each loss could be replaced by new talent. Japan chose the opposite path. Their masters of the air, the men who had conquered China and struck Pearl Harbor, remained on the front lines until death claimed them. Each battle drained away years of irreplaceable experience. Every zero lost carried not only a pilot, but thousands of hours of training that could never be rebuilt. The second flaw lay deep within the carriers themselves. Hangars were designed to cram as many aircraft as possible, stacked with fuel lines and bombs ready for the next strike. There was little thought of defense. Damage control was a bucket brigade. Firefighting was left to spirit and faith. American ships trained crews to seal compartments, to battle flames with machines. Japanese ships left men to face infernos with little more than water and courage. These weaknesses collided with fate at a place called Midway. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, prepared to finish the American fleet. Their decks swarmed with fueled aircraft. Officers believed the enemy too far, too slow, too weak to strike. They were wrong. From the sky came the wail of American dive bombers. Out of sunlight they plunged, sirens screaming, and in minutes the ocean was fire. A single bomb pierced Akagi's deck, igniting fuel lines below. Flames tore through the hangars, consuming paint, oxygen, flesh. Kaga was struck by 3 bombs, each detonating among fueled planes, explosions racing through the ship like fire in dry grass. Soryu took 3 hits. Hiryu fought back for hours before succumbing to American strikes. By nightfall, 4 carriers were gone. More than 3,000 men were dead. Survivors described the horror not in strategy but in senses, the roar of flames drowning their cries, steel turning molten beneath their boots, the sea itself burning with fuel. One sailor said the hangar was not a deck but a crematorium. It was more than the loss of ships. It was the loss of Japan's finest aviators, men trained for years, erased in hours. Their replacements were boys with fewer than 30 hours in the air, some who had never landed on a moving carrier. The fleet that had been sharpened to perfection was blunted beyond repair. And yet Tokyo did not abandon its doctrine. The admirals clung to Kantai Kessen, the dream of a single decisive battle. They believed spirit could bridge the growing gap in numbers, but spirit cannot refill hangars with aircraft. Spirit cannot train a pilot overnight. Spirit cannot replace a carrier sunk in flames. Meanwhile, America was awakening to its strength. Factories rolled out planes and ships at a pace no island empire could match. Veterans returned home to train thousands. The arithmetic was merciless. Japan lost in days what it could not rebuild in years, while the United States gained in months what Japan could not imagine. After Midway, the Imperial Navy still possessed carriers. They still carried aircraft. They still launched men into battle. But the heart was gone. The elite had perished in a single day. What remained was hollow steel and hollow doctrine, a force sailing on faith alone. The tragedy of Midway was not only defeat, it was prophecy. It revealed the future of the Japanese carrier fleet. To fight without hope of replacement, to sacrifice until nothing remained but smoke and ghosts. 2 years after Midway, the carrier force of Japan sailed once more, but it was a shadow of its former self. The veterans were gone, replaced by boys scarcely trained, many with fewer than 30 hours in the air. Some had never once landed on a moving deck. And yet they were sent into the sky against the most formidable naval aviation armada the world had ever seen. On June 19, 1944, the Imperial Navy sought to halt the American advance at the Philippine Sea. Carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho launched wave after wave of aircraft, hundreds of planes rising into the Sunday. What followed was not battle but massacre. American fighters, guided by radar, tore through Japanese formations with ruthless precision. Torpedo planes fell into the sea before reaching their targets. Dive bombers disintegrated under gunfire. By nightfall, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were gone, their pilots swallowed by smoke and water. American losses were 29 planes. The kill ratio was 13-1. Sailors aboard United States carriers called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japanese survivors, it was slaughter in the sky. The ocean claimed more than aircraft that day. Beneath the waves, torpedoes struck at the carriers themselves. The brand new Taiho, pride of the fleet, was hit by a single submarine torpedo. The damage seemed survivable, but gasoline fumes spread through her ventilation system. Hours later, one spark turned the ship into an erupting volcano of steel and flame. More than 1,000 men perished. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, was struck by multiple torpedoes. Fires raged uncontrollably. She rolled and slipped beneath the waves, 1,200 sailors vanishing with her. Survivors recalled the sea itself catching fire, waves coated with burning fuel. Even Japan's last great gamble, the Shinano, the largest carrier ever built at 72,000 tons, proved cursed. Rushed to sea without full training or equipment, she was struck by 4 submarine torpedoes on her maiden voyage. Watertight doors remained open, pumps idle, damage control unready. Within 24 hours, she rolled and sank. 1,400 men entombed in her hull. By now, the arithmetic was undeniable. America was producing 2,500 pilots each month. Japan could barely field 200. Factories in the United States delivered carriers and aircraft faster than Japan could count its losses. The Empire's fleet was bleeding out, not in sudden defeat alone, but in a steady hemorrhage of men, steel, and hope. Desperation birthed a final transformation. Carriers ceased to be instruments of battle. They became launch pads for one-way missions. Kamikaze pilots, many scarcely out of school, saluted their comrades before roaring into the sky, knowing they would never return. On the decks below, sailors watched in silence, understanding that their own lives would likely end the same way in sacrifice without survival. At Leyte Gulf, Zuikaku, the last of the original Pearl Harbor carriers, fought her final action. Surrounded, battered by bombs and torpedoes, she rolled and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The rising sun flag slipped beneath the waves, never to rise again. At Okinawa, other carriers such as Amagi and Katsuragi sat helpless in harbor, waiting for aircraft that never came. American bombers reduced them to wreckage at anchor. Crews died at their posts, surrounded not by glory but by silence and ruin. The collapse of the Japanese carrier fleet was not sudden thunder but a chain of calamities. Each defeat cut deeper, each sinking erased another generation, until nothing remained but rusting hulks and the ghosts of the men who had sailed them. By 1945, the mightiest carrier armada Japan had ever assembled no longer existed. What began as the sharpest blade of the Pacific had become a flotilla of tombs scattered across the ocean floor. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, nothing remained of Japan's proud carrier fleet. 10 mighty ships had once ruled the Pacific, their decks alive with the hum of engines and the shouts of pilots. By war's end, all were gone. Beneath the waves lay Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Shinano, and more. They were no longer weapons. they were graves. 91% of the men who had walked those decks never came home. 25,000 sailors and aviators vanished into fire and salt water. Their families received only silence, their portraits left hanging in homes across Japan. The empire told them it was honor, but honor could not raise the dead. Today, divers descend into the rusted halls of these wrecks. Flashlights sweep across silent hangars where Zero fighters once waited to launch. Fish glide through corridors where sailors once ran in panic. The sea keeps its secrets, but it does not lie. It tells us that spirit alone cannot fight mathematics, that courage chained to flawed doctrine becomes futility. For America and the Allies, the destruction of Japan's carriers confirmed a new truth. Naval power no longer rested in battleships but in aviation, in training, in logistics, in adaptation. For Japan, the legacy was not victory or even defeat, but tragedy vast enough to fill an ocean. The lesson endures. Blind faith, no matter how fierce, cannot bend steel or replace numbers. Sacrifice, when demanded without reason, destroys more than it preserves. The story of the Japanese carriers is not only about war, but about the cost of illusions. This was the true cost of World War II. The carriers became steel tombs of World War II, and in the silence of the Pacific, the waves still whisper the lessons of World War II. If this story moves something in your heart, do not let it sink into silence. Share it, speak it, remember it. Because only by remembering can we hope for a future of freedom, of independence, of peace. The war ended, but the silence it left behind was deafening. Across Japan, villages and cities alike were draped in grief. Entire generations of young men had been erased. Mothers clutched faded photographs, fathers bowed their heads in shame and sorrow. The rising sun flag no longer waved above a proud fleet. It was lowered in defeat, in ruin, in mourning. The survivors who staggered home from the Pacific carried scars far deeper than the burns on their skin. They carried the memories of shipmates lost in firestorms, of screams fading beneath black smoke, of seas that burned like oil. Many could not speak of what they had seen. Some never set foot near the ocean again. Others spent their lives haunted by the ghosts of steel cities that had become their coffins. For the families of the calm, 91%, who never returned, life became a quiet struggle against absence. A son who had once been a farmer's helper was gone. A husband who had once written letters filled with dreams of peace was never seen again. The empire had promised them honor, but honor could not feed a family. It could not embrace a widow. It could not replace a child's father. Yet even in defeat, the story of Japan's carriers holds meaning far beyond the islands of the Pacific. For America, the war was proof of what industry, adaptation, and unity could achieve. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, building one bomber every hour, showed that victory belonged not only to soldiers but to workers, to women, to minorities who riveted steel in factories. The silent power of production lines outmatched the proud cries of Bushido. This lesson would shape the world to come. The United States emerged from the war not only victorious but transformed into a global superpower. Its carriers, now more numerous and advanced than ever, replaced battleships as the new rulers of the sea. The Pacific proved beyond doubt that the aircraft carrier had become the central weapon of modern warfare, a truth that remains to this day. For Japan, the legacy was harder. The nation that had once believed itself destined to dominate Asia now faced occupation, ruin, and the need to rebuild from ashes. But in that rebuilding lay a different kind of strength. Japan, denied its empire, found power not in conquest but in creation. Factories once used for war shifted to produce cars, electronics, and technology that would soon circle the globe. Out of defeat arose a different vision of greatness, one not built on sacrifice and illusion, but on innovation and peace. The carriers themselves, now silent beneath the waves, became markers of memory. Divers and historians visit them, not as monuments of triumph, but as reminders of what unchecked pride can destroy. The Pacific Ocean holds them as tombs, but also as teachers. Each rusted beam, each collapsed hangar, whispers the same warning. When leaders place spirit above reality, when they gamble human lives on illusions, tragedy follows. For humanity as a whole, the story is more than Japanese, more than American. It is a story about the limits of courage, the power of adaptation, and the eternal cost of arrogance. It asks us to remember that war is not measured in victories or defeats alone, but in the lives it devours, the futures it erases, the voices it silences. And so, as we look back across 80 years, the lesson remains clear. The ocean does not care for spirit. It does not bend to illusions. It listens only to steel, to numbers, to fire. But above all, it carries the voices of those who were lost, whispering across generations, never again. The carriers of Japan's Imperial Navy are gone, but their legacy endures. Not as symbols of power, but as warnings carved in rust and salt. Their story is not only the story of Japan, not only the story of America, but the story of all nations that seek to gamble human lives for pride. This, too, is part of the cost of war. This, too, is part of the legacy of World War II.